guys, this is the video recording for, we're going to finish up chapter 4. There's just a little bit on the coverings and lining the membranes, the back of the page, and then I'm going to go over chapter 5. So let's finish up chapter 4. We talked about the nervous system on the last lecture, and so this one we are around page 142 to 143, and what we're just going to go over is membranes. And so with membranes, there's actually 4 different types of membranes that are found in the human body. So there's the cutaneous membrane, the mucous membranes, serous and synovial membranes. So the first one, the cutaneous membrane, that's basically our skin. So the definition of a membrane is actually epithelial tissue and connective tissue together. So if you put epithelial tissue with that basement membrane, then it's connected to connective tissue, that is a membrane. And so we have 4 different types throughout the body. So again, the first one is the cutaneous membrane, or the skin. That's actually called the integumentary system, which is what I'm going to lecture over in chapter 5. So chapter 5 is all about the integumentary system, or our cutaneous membrane. So we'll get to that in chapter 5. Another type of membrane is the mucous membrane. So mucous membrane, this kind of membrane is found lining cavities that open up to the exterior world. So that would include your nasal cavity, your oral cavity, and then the urogenital openings. So for example, the urethra, the anus, and then also the vagina. So those are openings that all have mucous membrane lining. And what that is, again, it's epithelial tissue with connective tissue underneath, but for the mucous membrane, those cells in that area produce mucus to help basically keep that tissue moist, and also to trap any foreign things and help move things along. Okay, the third one I have in the notes is the serous membrane. So serous membrane, these are the membranes that we went over in chapter 1, but it's like the visceral layer and the parietal layers. So like the visceral and parietal layers that cover the lungs, so the pleura, the pericardium, and then also the peritoneum, that's the membrane that lines the abdominal pelvic cavity. That's all called serous membranes. So you have epithelial connective tissue, and then again, in between like the visceral and the parietal layers, you'd have some fluid, and that fluid's called serous fluid, so a watery type of fluid. The fourth one I have in the notes is called synovial membranes. Synovial membranes, that lines synovial joints. Again, a joint is where you have a bone that comes together with another bone, and there are different types of joints, but one specific type of joint is the synovial joint, and that's the one that's completely enclosed, and inside there's fluid in there called synovial fluid. So, so that's the synovial membrane that makes and secretes the synovial fluid into that joint. And we'll actually talk more about synovial joints when we get to exam number 3. So we'll revisit that. Okay, so our next chapter, like I said, we're just going to go over the cutaneous membrane, which is also called the integumentary system. And then just lastly that I have in chapter 4 notes, we've got tissue repair, and we went over tissue repair as we were kind of going through each of the tissues. In this chapter, you know, some can repair themselves by mitosis, some can't. Anyways, that's just the last little bit of these notes. Okay, well good. So we are done with chapter 4. So next, let's move on to chapter 5. So everybody should have those notes. But chapter 5, what we're going over is, it's called the integumentary system. So That's our skin. So the integumentary system is made up of the cutaneous membrane. So we have epithelial tissue connected to connective tissue. And then with the system, we have our skin, but then that also includes all of our hair, our nails, fingernails, toenails, and then also the glands that are associated. So we have 2 types of sweat glands and an oil gland that we're going to go over. So that's what we're going to cover in this chapter. So if you turn to page 151 or figure 5.1, you'll see a figure there. And this is the same figure that's going to be on your exam. That's going to be on Tuesday, October 3rd. So you'll have to label the major layers. So the layers that you're going to have to label on this diagram includes the epidermis, which is the top layer, the dermis, and the dermis is actually divided into 2 different layers called the papillary layer and the reticular layer. And then underneath the dermis, you have an area called the hypodermis, which is basically adipose tissue. So sometimes the hypodermis is also called subcutaneous layer or just adipose tissue. So either way, know that's what it's called. So anyway, study those layers. Again, epidermis, dermis with the papillary layer, reticular layer, and then the hypodermis, again, either called hypodermis, subcutaneous layer, or adipose tissue. You have to label that figure in the exam. Okay, well, let's start out with the skin, and what we're going to do is go through the different layers of it. And so you can really classify the skin as having 2 layers and sometimes a 3rd layer depending on how they classify that adipose layer. But the 2 major layers of the skin are the epidermis and the dermis. So as you can see in figure 5.1, the epidermis is the uppermost layer. So I'm going to draw a picture up here. And so here is going to be from here to here. We're going to label this one as the epidermis. And then below here, where there's lots of blood vessels and nerves, this is going to be referred to as the dermis. And then below the dermis, that's the adipose tissue, or subcutaneous layer, or hypodermis. So hypodermis. So the 2 major layers are the epidermis and the dermis. Sometimes they'll include the hypodermis as a layer of the dermis, or they'll just include it as its own kind of separate layer. So either way, we're going to go through the epidermis and then talk about the dermis, but we'll start with the epidermis first. So the epidermis is your outside of your skin. So all the outside part of your skin, that's the epidermis. And so the epidermis is made out of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So it's all epithelial tissue. It's multiple layers of squamous shaped cells, and these cells are full of keratin that they make themselves and then just store in there. So it's a great waterproof layer. It's a good protection from the outside world, but that's what the epidermis is. And there's different types of cells that are found in the epidermal layers, and there's also different types of layers in the epidermis itself. So we're going to go through those before we get to our second layer, which is the dermis. So let's go over the different types of cells in the epidermis, and then so I'll talk about the different types of cells, and then after we go over the cells, we'll go through the different layers, and then I'll let you know where the cells are found in what different layers. So let's see. So the majority of cells that are found in the epidermis are called keratinocytes. And keratinocytes are just your regular squamous-shaped cells, but they make a lot of keratin. And that keratin, again, stays inside of the cells. So these cells are full of this protein called keratin, and keratin makes them nice and waterproof and, you know, kind of thick, leathery, if you kind of think about that. So anyways, most of the cells in the epidermis are just called keratinocytes. And again, squamous-shaped cells that make keratin and just store it inside of them, right? Another type of cell are called melanocytes. Melanocytes are kind of funny-looking cells, almost look like an octopus. They're large with these long extensions that come off of them, look like pseudopods or octopus arms. And there aren't as many melanocytes, but melanocytes are found in the deepest layer of the epidermis called the stratum basale, which I'll draw up here in just a little bit. But melanocytes make a protein which is called melanin. And melanin has a dark brown color to it, and that's one type of pigment that we see in our skin. And so the melanocytes make melanin, and the melanin can actually be packaged and secreted from the melanocytes, and then they can be taken into the keratinocytes. So the keratinocytes that make keratin, that stores the keratin inside, can actually have melanin inside of them as well, but that melanin is produced by the melanocytes. So I'll go over that in just a little bit. The other type of cells that you'll see in the epidermis are called dendritic cells or Langerhans cells. Dendritic cells, if you want to write this in the notes, they're a type of white blood cell. They're basically like a macrophage, which is a phagocytic cell, but they're found in the actual tissue. Anyways, dendritic cells are just a type of white blood cell. You'll also see some nerve endings. They're called tactile or Merkel cells. This is the end of the nerve. So a neuron would go up through the dermis, and then it would end right at the base of the epidermis, and then the tip of it would be found in the epidermis, even though the actual nerve or neuron itself is just found in the dermis. So that just gives us different types of sensations. So those receptors allow us to feel like temperature on our skin, also pressure on our skin, and even pain as well. So that's the type of receptors that we have associated with the skin. So again, temperature, pressure, and pain. But that comes from those tactile or Merkel cells that end right at the base of the epidermis. Okay, so I'll bring up some of these cells as we go through the different layers of the epidermis, but so again, figure 5.1, you can see the epidermis at the top. It's just this little bit right here. And if you were to kind of compare, like, how thick is the epidermis, if you think about a paper towel, if you were to get a paper towel and the thickness of the paper towel, that's as thick as your epidermis is. I mean, it can get a little bit thicker in certain areas and maybe even a little bit thinner in other areas, but overall, your epidermis is about as thick as a paper towel. So it's not very, very thick. And if you take that thickness, we can actually divide it into 5 layers. So those layers are labeled on page 152 or figure 5.2. So if you want to turn to that page, you can see this is just the layers of the epidermis. And so there are 5 layers to the epidermis. However, most of your epidermis only has 4 layers. The areas where you'd see the 5th layer would be on the palms of your hands or on the soles of your feet. Other than that, the rest of your epidermis everywhere else just has 4 layers, but I'll go through all 5 layers with you. So let's start with the deepest layer of your epidermis, which would be right down here. So this would be the deepest layer of the epidermis, and that layer is referred to as the stratum basal, or the base layer. So the stratum basal, you can see that in your book there. It's right at the base, right where the dermis comes up. And the stratum basal is the deepest layer, and it's made up of the most active cells. This is where the keratinocytes are undergoing mitosis. So the keratinocytes are reproducing by mitosis, and then as they reproduce, the cells get pushed up and up and up towards the most superficial layer of the epidermis. So again, this is where the keratinocytes are undergoing mitosis, so very active. This is also where you'll find a lot of dendritic cells, and then also the melanocytes too. So they do have a melanocyte pictured in figure 5.2b. It shows it there, and you can see it's kind of this gray color, and it has these little extensions that go out through there. But with the stratum basal, again, here would be just the keratinocytes right down here. As they undergo mitosis, they reproduce, produce a new cell, and then the new cells get pushed up, and then the other ones down here undergo mitosis again. So you just continually produce new keratinocytes, and the new ones get pushed up, up, up until they eventually get to the very outer layer of the epidermis. So highly mitotic keratinocytes in there. And then also we see those melanocytes. Now the melanocytes, they're found in the deep layer, and some of their little octopus legs or little pseudopods extend up into the other layers, but the melanocytes, where the cell body, they're established in the stratum basal. And so again, the melanocytes produce melanin, the keratinocytes produce keratin, but this is where they're very, very active. So a very active layer, okay? All right, now the next one as we go up is called the stratum spinosum, sometimes referred to as the prickly layer. But this layer is a few cell layers thick. It contains those newly made keratinocytes that have just undergone mitosis. They also have melanin granules as well. Again, the melanocytes make the melanin, and like I said earlier, they can secrete that melanin, and that melanin can be taken up by the keratinocytes. So you'll see a lot of keratinocytes, newly formed keratinocytes, as well as melanin inside of those guys that was picked up from the melanocytes. And this is actually where you have the highest actual concentration of dendritic cells, or those white blood cells. So you see those in the basal and this layer, but a lot of them in this layer. Okay, now the third layer going up is called the stratum granulosum. And this is where you see a lot of keratinocytes undergoing changes, and by changes, meaning they're dying, basically. So if we go back to the stratum basal layer down here, this is where the keratinocytes are undergoing mitosis. And then as they undergo mitosis and the new cells are getting pushed up farther away from the stratum basal, those cells are getting farther away from their blood supply. Because remember, epithelial tissue does not have any blood vessels. So all that oxygen and nutrients for these cells comes from the dermal layer. And as these cells get pushed farther and farther away from the blood vessels, they start to die. But they're full of keratin. So they become less active the farther they get away, but they get smushed together, and they have all that keratin in them. So that's kind of what's happening in that stratum granulosum. The keratinocytes are basically dying and becoming that tough keratinized layer. Okay, now in your book, there should be another layer right above the stratum granulosum, and the next layer should be the stratum lucidum. I have it in the notes that they don't have it labeled in that figure in 5.2, but it would be right above the stratum granulosum, right below the stratum corneum. But this layer, the stratum lucidum, this is the fifth layer that you only see in certain areas, and those certain areas include, again, the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So stratum lucidum means clear layer, and if you think about it, if you look at the soles of your feet or the palms of your hand, it's almost like a shinier kind of layer than the rest of your skin, and it's because it has this fifth layer in it called the stratum lucidum. It's just an extra few layers of dead keratinocytes. And the reason you have an extra layer is because you have lots of wear and tear on these areas, so your skin just has an extra layer of dead cells for extra protection. You could form a stratum lucidum pretty much anywhere on your skin if you put extra pressure on it. So if you were to get a callus somewhere, that would basically be forming a fifth layer, and it's just to provide more protection from whatever you're doing to that area of skin, right? All right, now the outermost layer though, up here, the outermost layer is made up of multiple layers of dead keratinocytes that have lots of keratin in it, and then as well melanin too. But they're all dead. So it's a layer of dead cells. They say about 20 to 30 layers of dead cells. So they're so far away from their nutrient source that by the time they get up here, they're just dead, but they're tightly packed together, and this is what gives you that really good protection from the outside world. But the stratum corneum is constantly being shed, so you can scrape it and these dead cells come off. But the good thing is, even though you're shedding your skin all the time, as long as the stratum basal is undergoing mitosis, you're reproducing those keratinocytes to replace those cells that have been sloughed off. And I forget how much gets sloughed off, and it probably says in your book, it does say over on page 153 in the left-hand column, like the second paragraph from the top, it says millions of dead keratinocytes rub off every day, giving us totally new epidermis every 25 to 45 days. So that's pretty interesting. So about every month, you have a full brand new epidermis, so it's highly regenerative. All right, so that's about all I want to talk about for the layers of the epidermis. We'll come back and talk more about melanin and the melanocytes when we go over the pigment of our skin, so we'll come back to that a little bit. All right, so now let's go on to our second layer. So underneath the dermis, so again you have an epidermis, then you'd have that basement membrane that it's attached to, and then you have the dermis down here. And the dermis is mostly connective tissue. There's some, nerves that run through, so some nervous tissue, but it's mostly connective tissue. So let's look at, I don't know, there's a couple good pictures. You can go back to the original picture in figure 5.1 if you want to look at the dermis there. But again, the dermis is much thicker than the epidermis. It has a lot of blood vessels. It has nerves running through it. This is actually where the hair bulb is found. Even though the hair is part of the epidermis, it grows down into the dermis. So there's a lot going on in the dermal layers. And we're going to take the dermis and divide it into two layers. So in figure 5.1, if you look at the dermis, you can see that there are two different layers. There's the superficial layer, which is called the papillary layer, that's right next to the epidermis. And then we have the second layer, which is called the reticular layer, which is right down there. So let's talk about those two different layers. So the dermal layer is the papillary layer is sometimes called the dermal papillary layer. So papillary layer is what I'll call it. It's not very big. So if I color it, if I do it in the purple color right here, it would only be right around here. And it kind of has these little projections that stick up, but not very, very thick, only from to about here. So this would be the papillary layer. And so the papillary layer, not very big, but what it does is the papillary layer is made of connective tissue, and it forms these little ridges that end up pushing into the epidermis and end up actually pushing the epidermis up as well. And so these little ridges that the papillary layer forms actually gives rise to our fingerprints. So if you look at, your fingertips, you can also look at your fingers or even your palms, sometimes even into your wrist and even on your skin. You'll see these little ridges that poke up, especially your fingertips. But those little ridges that you see on your epidermis are actually created by the papillary layer of the dermis. And so that's really kind of the function of the papillary layer, is to make fingerprints or little ridges. And the purpose of those is to help with gripping. So that's the purpose of those. So anyways, your fingerprints actually don't really come from your epidermis, they actually come from your papillary layer. So for example, if you were to burn or damage just the epidermal layer, at the time that is damaged, you wouldn't have your fingerprints. But once the epidermis regrows, as long as the papillary layer wasn't fully damaged, your fingerprints will come back just like they were. To really change your fingerprints, you'd have to damage all the way down into that papillary layer to actually change those prints. So anyways, that's the first layer, the papillary layer. Again, you can see that on page 151. You can also see the papillary layer over on page 154, figure 5.3. So if you want to look at that. Anyways, the type of tissue that the papillary layer is made up of is just that loose or areolar tissue, but that's what that one is made out of. Okay, now the layer right below the papillary layer, basically, so here's the papillary layer, and then below that, the rest of the dermis right here is called the reticular layer. So the reticular layer is the thickest layer of the dermis. And the reticular layer, again, you can see it, page 154, you can go back to page 151, either way. But the reticular layer, that's where you get lots of the blood vessels, the nerves, a lot of stuff going on in the reticular layer. But one thing also that the reticular layer forms is something called cleavage lines and flexure lines. So you can actually see these over on page 155. The flexure lines, we'll do that one first. Flexure lines are basically the large creases that you see in your skin. So like if somebody were to read the palm of your hand, where they would be following those flexure lines. So you have flexure lines on your palm, your fingers, you have them on the back of your fingers, your wrist, wherever you have creases in your skin, elbows, knees, wherever, face, neck, those are called flexure lines. It's just an area of the reticular layer where there's less collagen in that area. So where you bend those joints a lot, and anyways you get those flexure lines. Another thing that we see in the reticular layer is called cleavage lines. In actuality, you can't see the cleavage lines, but if you look on page 155 or figure 5.4b, you'll see a person with some lines drawn all over them. And these cleavage lines basically represent the pattern of the fibers of collagen and how they run. You might be thinking, well, what's the purpose of that if you can't see the cleavage lines? What's important? Cleavage lines allow for better regeneration of that tissue. So if you were to have surgery, for example, and you're thinking about the arm, so they're showing the arm here, and if you were to cut maybe straight across for surgery and then hope that that tissue would heal, instead of cutting straight across, it would be better to cut maybe at an angle, because that's the way that the cleavage line runs, and so it would heal up a little bit better. So anyways, that's what the cleavage lines are, but that, again, just how the collagen is arranged in that reticular layer. So anyways, reticular layer is talked about on page 155. And so you can see those pictures there. Yeah. Also over on page 156, it talks about scars in the homeostatic imbalance, and it also talks about stretch marks as well. So in the homeostatic imbalance on page 156, it says extreme stretching of the skin, such as during pregnancy, can actually tear the dermis, and it leaves these little white scars where the tissue tries to heal itself, but instead of forming the regular tissue, scar tissue forms, and those are called stretch marks. Anyways, it just talks about that right there. Also talks about burns, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so I think that's everything I wanted to talk about for the dermis. Just again, that papillary layer versus that reticular layer. All right. And just so you know, down here, the reticular layer is made of the dense irregular tissue. Remember, there's dense regular tissue, which would be like the tendons and the ligaments. This is the dense irregular, so obviously not as strong as those, but still lots of collagen in that area. Okay, well, good. So those are the two main layers, epidermis, dermis. Again, we have this other layer here, the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. Sometimes it's considered its own layer, or sometimes it's considered the deepest layer of the dermis. However, just know it as the hypodermis, subcutaneous layer, or adipose tissue. Okay. Well, good. So the next thing we want to talk about is skin color. So I have just a little bit about skin color down here, but you'll want to write this down or add some notes to the notes that I've given you. And skin color, this is over on page 156 and over onto page 157. All right. So there are actually 3 types of pigments that we see in the skin. There is melanin, keratin, not to get keratin confused with keratin. So keratin, the waterproof protein, is K-E-R-A-T-I-N. Keratin is a pigment, which is C-A-R-O-T-E-N-E. So those two are different, keratin, keratin. And we also have hemoglobin. So again, the 3 pigments, melanin, keratin, and hemoglobin. So melanin gives a brown color to the skin. Keratin gives an orangish yellow color to the skin. and hemoglobin gives our skin a pinkish reddish color. So let's talk about melanin first. So melanin, again, is made by the cells called melanocytes. And again, the melanocytes are found in the deepest layer of the epidermis, which is called the stratum basal. Now, the interesting thing about melanocytes is if you were to take all of us in the classroom or everyone in the world, and you looked at the number of melanocytes to the darkest colored person to the lightest colored person, they would actually have about the same number of melanocytes. So we all have very equal number of melanocytes in our skin. The only difference is the melanin production. So the more melanin production, the darker the skin looks, the lighter the skin looks. And so, so what programs basically the melanocytes to produce melanin would be our genetics, and then some external factors like UV exposure as well. But really the purpose of the melanocytes to produce melanin is a dark pigment, and so it absorbs that UV radiation from the sun, and when it absorbs that UV radiation, that prevents the UV radiation from damaging the cells in our epidermal layer. So it's really just protecting us from the sun. So the more melanin you produce, the more protection you have from UV radiation. And again, this is genetically determined. There are multiple genes that we inherit that depicts what skin tone we'll have. However, if you are out in the sun a lot, that will also increase melanin production, and certain hormones can increase or decrease melanin production as well, but we won't get into those. So anyways, melanin just imparts that brown pigment to our skin, also to our hair, and even to our eyes as well, which we'll talk about that later with the hair. The eyes we talk about in another chapter. Okay, the second pigment is called carotene. Now, carotene comes from vitamin A in our diet, and it gives us a yellow-orange pigment. So carotene, which is down on page 156, if we eat, so carotene or vitamin A, we use that for a number of different processes in our cells in our body. However, if we produce or if we intake or eat excess carotene, we end up storing it in our stratum corneum. So we end up storing it in this layer of our epidermis, that outer layer, so it gets stored in the epidermis. So the more, for example, carrots or sweet potatoes, yams, anything that has any fruit or vegetable that has a orange color to it, and even other like leafy green vegetables, anything that has a high content of vitamin A in it, then we will store that as carotene in our skin. So it'll actually look yellow or orange. So anyways, if you were to eat a diet, for example, of just carrots, let's say carrot soup for a week, you would actually turn orange or yellow because of that diet. It's just we store that excess carotene. So anyways, that's another pigment that we can store in our skin. And actually, like the self-tanning, they used to do like self-tanning lotions. I think there's still some out there that now they have like self-tanning pills people can take. And if you look at the lotions and the pills, they're just full of vitamin A with the vitamin A, that carotene. So if you take a pill that's loaded with that, then you're going to turn orange. Not really a tan color, but that's what they sell it as. Same with the lotions, the self-tanning lotions. It's just putting carotene on there, and it does soak in basically to your skin but it makes you look, like I said, more orange than a tan, which would be more of the melanin color. Anyways, so that's the second pigment. The third pigment is hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is found in your blood vessels. So in your blood vessels you have red blood cells, and inside of your red blood cells is this molecule called hemoglobin. It's made up of amino acids and some other elements in there. There's also iron in it, and then oxygen is attracted to the iron. And when the oxygen is attracted to the iron on the hemoglobin, it turns a red color. So in your blood vessels in your dermis, they're circulating in there, and when they're oxygenated, which they should always be oxygenated, you can see that pinkish red color through your epidermis. So that's another pigment that we can see is from the hemoglobin. You know, if your dermal blood vessels constrict when you're cold, then you don't look as pink or red, and you can look actually pale or blue color. If you're really warm or, you know, scared or something like that, nervous, your blood vessels will dilate, and then you have more blood flow to that area, so you'll look pinker or redder, right? So anyways, those are the three pigment layers of your skin: melanin, keratin, and hemoglobin. Okay, so the last part of this chapter, I'm going to talk about appendages of the skin. So we've got three kind of appendages to the skin. We've got hair, nails, and glands. So that's what we're going to finish up talking about. So let's go over hair first. There's some good pictures over on page 158 or figure 5-6. All right, so hair and hair follicles. So I'm just going to read through the notes here, and then we'll refer to the figure in your book. But hair, also called pili, are flexible little strands produced by hair follicles that basically just consist of dead keratinized cells. So your hair that you see is just dead cells, dead keratinized cells, just like your skin. Now the main regions of the hair include the shaft. The shaft is anything that sticks above the epidermis. So if here's the epidermis, the outer layer, the stratum corneum, anything that comes above that, that would be the hair shaft. So any hair that you see on your head, eyebrows, eyelashes, on your arms, wherever, and that hair that you're seeing is referred to as the shaft, so the hair shaft, so it's dead. Then you also have the root, and the root is what is embedded down in the skin. And so the hair root, the root or hair itself is actually part of the epidermis, but it goes deep down into the dermal layer. And you can actually look at a picture. If you go back to that first figure, figure 5-1, you can see the shaft, and then if you follow the shaft, you can see it goes through the epidermis, and you see the epidermal layer is kind of, well, for those of you who have color, it's kind of that orangish gold color, but you see the epidermis actually goes down into the dermis, and then that's where the root of the hair actually begins. So, like I said, the hair is actually part of the epidermis, it's just rooted down in the dermis. Okay. So we have the hair shaft, we have the root, and then if you were to actually take the hair and cut it, it has 3 different layers. So you can refer to these on page 158 or figure 5-6. So you can see a cross section of the hair, and it actually includes the root in it with this one. But the 3 layers of your hair, the most inner part of your hair is called the medulla. The middle layer is called the cortex, and then the outer layer would be the cuticle. So in your book on page 158, figure A, it shows that cross section of your hair, but it's showing the root that's down in the dermis. But if you were just to take your hair shaft, there'd only be those 3 layers: the medulla, cortex, and cuticle. So the cuticle would be that outermost layer. So now your hair is also colored or pigmented, and again, this comes from the melanin in the melanocytes. And so those are actually found deep in the base of the root, which we'll go over here in just a second. But the more melanin the melanocytes produce in your hair root, the darker your hair will be. The less melanin that is produced, the lighter color it would be. If there's a complete lack of melanin, either because the melanocytes are not producing melanin, or sometimes little air bubbles actually get trapped in there, then a hair will end up turning gray. And if you put multiple gray hairs together, that's what we call white hair. So if somebody had all gray hair, it'd actually be called white hair. So gray and white hair is just basically the same thing. All right, so let's look at the actual structure of the hair follicle. So I like the picture on 158. I like figure 5-6C, so that picture down in the lower left-hand corner. So the hair follicle, again, is what goes all the way down into the dermis. It's part of the epidermis, but it's down in the dermis. Sometimes it goes even deeper down into the hypodermis, so it can go pretty deep. But what we have there is an expanded portion where it comes down and then it bulbs out like that. The deep end of the hair follicle is the bulb. And the bulb, this is where we see lots of nerve endings deep down in there. So that's where you see it's like the swollen area. So nerves, so if you were to pull your hair out and you pull that part out, that's what would hurt. Now also down in that area, you have an area called the hair matrix. So the hair matrix, you guys can see that. You have the hair matrix labeled over there. The hair matrix is the area of mitosis. This is where the cells, the keratinocytes, are undergoing mitosis, and then as they reproduce, they get pushed up and up and up, and they go up that follicle, and then they end up becoming the shaft of the hair. So your hair actually grows from the hair matrix, and if you look right around that hair matrix on either side, see kind of the brown cells, there's the melanocytes. And so the melanocytes, again, are the ones that produce the melanin. The melanin is packaged and secreted, and it ends up going into those keratinocytes that are being produced. So hair color comes from the melanocytes right by those keratinocytes that are undergoing mitosis. And then again, as it undergoes mitosis, the hair just gets pushed up and up and up, and it's just those keratinocytes getting smushed together and dying, and then that's just what becomes your hair with those 3 different layers. It's, again, the outer cuticle, cortex, and the medulla of your hair. So that's basically the anatomy kind of the hair, and the physiology also of how it's reproduced. But with each of your hairs, there is a little muscle associated with it called the erector pili muscle. You can see this in that little diagram on 158, but you can also see it back on page 151. So with each hair follicle, there's a little muscle called the erector pili muscle, and these little muscles are smooth muscle. So I don't know if you guys remember, but smooth muscle is involuntary. You don't control those. So what controls the erector pili muscle is basically your sympathetic division. And when this part of your nervous division kicks in, it causes the erector pili muscle to contract. And when the erector pili muscle contracts, it pulls on that hair follicle, and then it pulls on that shaft and allows it to stand up. So when your hair stands up on end, it's because the erector pili muscles have contracted. And this will also form goosebumps as well on your skin, so it makes the little ridges on your skin. So that can be activated for whatever reason whenever your fight or flight system kicks in. But the main thing it's supposed to do is prevent heat loss, so it actually conserves heat. So puts the hair up on end and then does this little, the goosebumps with your skin. So it helps to conserve some heat in your skin. But anyways, you can see those little muscles on either of those two pictures. All right. So let's see. The next section we have of hair is different types of hair. So this is on page 159, and it goes over to page 160. But if you look at your hairs, you notice there's different types of hair. It basically comes from the thickness and also the length of your hair. So the hairs that are found on, mostly like on the abdomen or on your arms, legs, especially in females or children, you'll see a thinner type of hair. And this thin type of hair, little thin type of hair, that's called fine or vellus hairs. So again, mostly found on women, like on just arms, legs, torso, back, face, and then in children, you find these vellus hairs. They're just thinner, they don't grow very long, versus other types of hair, which is called coarse or terminal hair. Coarse or terminal hair would be the hair that's found on your head, your eyebrows, your eyelashes, and then also in like the axillary regions, armpits, the pubic regions, and then generally in males, like their chest hair, or if you even think of some of their arm hair, leg hair is usually a little bit thicker than the females, and that's considered coarse hair as well. So anyways, two types of hair, the really thin vellus versus the thicker coarse or terminal hairs. Now these hairs, depending on if they're fine or coarse, they're basically determined by many factors, which include your nutrition, also your hormones, whether you're male, female, whether you're a child, whether you're going through puberty, whether you're elderly. So there are a number of things that influence your hair, but in particular, why is it on our head we grow, that thicker hair here, as well as our eyebrows, eyelashes, the pubic areas. Those hair follicles, which are stimulated by different hormones, they also have a pre-genetic program in there that tells them to grow thicker and pre-programs how long they're going to grow for. So, for example, the rate of hair growth, it varies from region to region and sex to sex, but on average it's about 2.5 millimeters a week. And so if you were to look at like the growth, for example, of your head hair versus your eyebrows, okay? So obviously your eyebrows don't grow as long as the hair on your head. And the reason is the follicles of the hair in your eyebrows are programmed for that hair to grow for maybe a few weeks, and then that follicle shuts down and that hair will no longer grow, but eventually it will fall out. And then a new follicle, maybe in that same area, will start to grow a new one that will grow for a couple weeks, that'll turn off, that will fall out, and then a new one will start growing. So the pre-programmed time for growth is very short, which is why some of our hairs only get so long, right? Versus other ones, like on our head, for example, that follicle, so if you take a hair follicle on your head, that gets turned on, but instead of growing for only a couple weeks, that might grow for months or a year, depending on how long your hair can grow. So some people can grow really long hair. Some people's hair only gets to a certain length before it turns off. And that's a genetic pre-programmed thing in how long your hair is going to grow. So anyways, that's why we have different lengths of hair. It's just this pre-programmed thing, but also how healthy your hair looks, how much you grow, that is influenced by nutrition as well as hormones too. Okay? So anyway, it's kind of interesting. I find that interesting. The book also talks about hair thinning and baldness, which is over on page 160. So they say after about age 40, hair is not replaced as quick as it is lost. Basically, you've got all these hair follicles, you know, and maybe as we're younger, a lot of those follicles are turned on and they're growing hair. And then as we get older, some of those follicles just die off. And so we're not producing as much hair, and so it's actually thinner. And that happens in males and females, where our hair just thins. And so the hair thinning, which can actually lead to baldness, is called alopecia. And like I said, it does happen in both males and females as we get older. But there is something called male pattern baldness, which obviously is found in males or somebody who carries the Y chromosome. But this is influenced by a gene that responds to something called DHT. DHT stands for dihydrotestosterone. So it's a testosterone-influenced type of gene. We're not going to get into the genetics of it, but that's why it influences the males, because they have the Y chromosome. Anyways, on average, they say that we lose about 100 hairs a day. Hopefully we make about 100 hairs a day, but eventually when we start losing 100 hairs a day, maybe we only replace it with 90 and then 80, and then that just leads to the hair thinning. But anyways, the book does talk about hair thinning and factors that can influence it. It's in the homeostatic imbalance on page 160. All right. Okay. So good. Hope you guys are following. The good thing is you can stop this and re-listen to it, pause it, stop it, re-listen to it. But let's go over our second appendage here, which are the nails. So nails are over on page 160, 161. So obviously we have fingernails and we also have toenails. They're actually derived from the epidermis. They're just dead keratinized cells, but they're arranged in a scale-like fashion. So that's really the difference between like your nails and your hair, is that it's arranged in an actual scale. So it looks like a scale. But the different parts of the nails that you can see, page 160 or figure 5.7, you've got the free edge of your nail. That's the part that hangs over. It's kind of that white color. You have the body of the nail. That's the main area of the nail. And then underneath the body of the nail, you actually have the nail bed. So right underneath your nail is the nail bed. That's what causes it to grow out in a flat kind of fashion. If you were to damage the nail bed, then your nail would grow crooked or wavy or whatever. And then way in the back of the nail, you have that white little area that goes under the cuticle. The white area is called the lunula, so like a moon. And then if you go back from that, you actually get to the root of the nail. So the root of the nail is back behind the lunula under that cuticle, and that's where your nail grows from. So the nail grows from the root, grows out over the nail bed, and that's what forms the nail body. So that's how your nail forms. So the nail, again, it's just like your skin and your hair, is you have this region of mitosis in that nail root, and these keratinocytes undergo mitosis, produce keratin, and then get pushed out and over your nail. And that's how your nail forms. The purpose of the nails, they say, is actually to protect your digits. I also think it helps with, doing things with your fingers. Anyways, it helps with some little tasks. But anyways, they're to protect your digits. Now, if you were to damage the nail root of your nail where that region of mitosis occurs and kill those cells off, your nail would not come back. If you were just to damage other parts of the nail, so maybe if you were to cut like the tip of your finger off and you didn't damage that nail root, the nail would grow back. But anytime you do damage the nail bed where the nail grows out over, that will change the appearance of the actual nail itself. So anyways, that's basically what nails are. I don't have anything else to talk about for that. The lunula, maybe I do have a couple other things. So the lunula, that little white part, the reason it's white is because the nail gets pushed down under the cuticle, and so it pushes on those blood vessels that are in the dermis under there, and that's just what causes it to look white. If you were to actually push anywhere on your nail, push down, it would actually turn it that same color as your lunula. So that's the reason that it's a lighter color. Sometimes students ask me, well, why do you get little like white marks or anything on your nails? And that's usually like a nutrient deficiency or just trauma, if you hit it or something like that. Anyways, that's about it. Okay. Let's go on to our sweat glands. So this is over page 161, 162. Again though, these are labeled really nicely on that first figure, which is page 151. So if you do want to look at that, it's figure 5.1. So I'm going to go over 3 different types of glands. We have our eccrine or merocrine glands. Remember, that means the same thing. So an eccrine or a merocrine gland means the same thing. These are our true sweat glands, okay? We're also going to go over apocrine sweat glands. These are like our stinky puberty glands. And then we'll go over sebaceous glands, which are our oil glands to help lubricate our skin and our hair. So let's do our eccrine or merocrine glands first. And again, figure 5.1, that first figure is a nice picture to look at. But our eccrine or merocrine glands, these glands are found all over our body. They're found all over in our skin, but they're highly concentrated in the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. You also see quite a few in our forehead as well. Even though they're found all over, that's where they're really densely populated. I think our book maybe talks about how many we have. Yeah, 3 million. We have 3 million sweat glands, so that's a lot all over the body. So anyways, these merocrine or eccrine sweat glands, they produce our typical watery type of sweat. So it's a watery type of sweat. It has urea in it, which is a nitrogen waste. It also has lots of solutes in it, like sodium, chloride, some potassium. That's the main stuff that's in our sweat. And the function of these guys is fully to control body temperature. So if we get hot, our sweat glands open up, release sweat onto the surface of our skin. That sweat evaporates and carries heat away from our body. If we're cold, the sweat glands turn off and it helps to conserve heat. That's what they're for. That's what they're for, is just body temperature control. Okay? Apocrine sweat glands, which are a little bit different, apocrine sweat glands are located in special areas. They're mostly located in our axillary regions and in our pubic regions. And apocrine sweat glands, these guys are not for body temperature control. These guys are only activated when we hit puberty, and then of course they stay active as well. But these are our puberty glands. So these apocrine sweat glands, they actually produce kind of a fatty protein sweat, which doesn't control body temperature, but it has this interesting aroma to it. And what they think the purpose of these are is because they're activated during puberty, it gives a scent that tells other people or other animals that that person is ready to reproduce. So they basically have hit puberty, and that's one way of knowing that they're ready to reproduce. So basically we say they have a role in reproduction, but that's basically what the apocrine sweat glands are. These are talked about on page 162, and the book says we have approximately 2,000 of these. And again, they're largely confined to the axillary and the genital regions. However, you can find some like on the face or back or chest. I mean, you can find them in other areas. It's just they're highly concentrated in those certain regions. All right, so those are the two main kind of sweat glands, the eccrine, merocrine, the apocrine. Apocrine are named apocrine, however, as you can see in the notes, they're technically secrete by the eccrine fashion, which is by exocytosis, but we're still just going to call them apocrine sweat glands. There are some modified sweat glands we find in the body. So we have ceruminous glands. These glands are actually found in our ear canal, so in the external auditory meatus. These are modified sweat glands. Instead of producing a type of sweat, you know, like a regular type of watery sweat, they secrete a waxy secretion, which is called cerumen, which is earwax. So again, it's really for protection to trap stuff that gets into our ear hole or our external auditory meatus. And also mammary glands are modified sweat glands. So if a woman is pregnant and then breastfeeds, her mammary glands will transform or mature, they say, into true mammary glands, and then they produce breast milk. So actually, yeah, mammary glands are just a modified sweat gland, which is kind of interesting. Okay, now the third type of gland is the sebaceous gland, and this is not a sweat gland, this is an oil gland. And sebaceous glands are actually associated with hairs. I mean, they don't have to be associated with hairs, but typically you see them associated with the hair. I like going back to that first figure, figure 5.1. So if you go back there and you look at that picture, you can actually see the eccrine glands labeled, and then you can see a sebaceous gland labeled, and see the sebaceous gland associated with the hair follicle. So sebaceous glands, they produce this oil secretion called sebum, S-E-B-U-M. And sebum comes out with the hair shaft or out into the pore onto the skin. And what sebum does is it acts as a lubricant and a protection for our skin so it doesn't dry out, and our hair. Sometimes it can also trap bacteria or any pathogens that get on there, so it kind of works with our immune system a little bit. But anyways, those are sebaceous glands, so associated with the hair or the skin as well. In the notes, the third, number 3 under sebaceous glands, I have sebaceous glands. I mean, they're turned on, I mean, whenever we need oil. But they can be influenced by hormones, so they can become overactive with hormone production. And so with acne, this usually comes from the sebaceous glands, and they get overactive and they can get clogged up. But you can see this, you know, on the face or on the back, usually as somebody's going through puberty. Anyways, yeah. Well, good. Okay, I'd ask if you have questions, but I can't answer any. So, unless you write them down, then you can email them to me. Okay. So really, that's everything for the skin and the accessory structures. Just to kind of wrap up, we're going to talk a little bit about the overall function of the skin, and then we'll do burns and skin cancer. Okay, So some of the functions of the integumentary system include protection, so chemical barrier protection, UV barrier protection, bacteria protection, you know, mechanical barrier from the outside world. So a really good protection. It's our first line of defense for many things. It really is basically our skin. It also plays an important role in regulating body temperature. So if your body temperature goes up, sweat glands turn on, your dermal blood vessels dilate, you'll get red, you'll evaporate heat away, and hopefully that'll bring temperature down. If your temperature goes down too low, sweat glands can turn off, dermal blood vessels can constrict, and then you can even form the goosebumps in your hair can stand up when you're cold. Again, that's to help to conserve heat. So your body's really, your skin's an important factor in heat, body temperature control, I should say. Another thing is we have sensations from our skin, and so the very beginning we talked about those little Merkel discs that are attached to neurons in the skin, and so you can perceive only a few different sensations from your skin. One is temperature, 2 is pressure, and 3 is pain. So you can feel that sensation from your skin. So cutaneous sensation, that's what we call skin sensation. Your skin also provides a metabolic function to make vitamin D. So in your epidermis, you actually have the precursor to vitamin D. It makes this precursor to vitamin D. It makes like a molecule, specific shape of a molecule. When UV radiation comes down, it changes the shape of that to help make vitamin D. So they say if you're exposed to the sun about 10 to 15 minutes a day without sunscreen, you make all the vitamin D you need for that day. So that's not bad at all. Let's see. It also acts as, I'm just reading in the notes here, E. The skin acts as a blood reservoir, so it holds quite a bit of blood in the dermal layer. And again, with the sweat, you can have urea in your sweat, which is a nitrogenous waste, so it's another way to get rid of waste. But let's go over to skin cancers and burns. So if you want to turn to page 165, there's different types of skin cancers, and here's a few that you can see, especially in Colorado, we have a pretty high, I think it's got UV index. But 3 major types of skin cancer called basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and melanoma. Just so you guys know, if you ever heard the term carcinoma, that's a cancer that arises from epithelial tissue. A sarcoma is cancer that arises from connective tissue. So that's the difference. So basal cell carcinoma, think about your basal layer, this comes from those keratinocytes that are undergoing mitosis in that deepest layer, that stratum basal layer. So yeah, they're highly mitotic, so for cancers to arise from there is not uncommon. It actually says this is the most common skin cancer, but it's not very malignant, meaning it doesn't spread very easily, which is good. You want to keep it in an area. However, it's very common. So you can see basal cell carcinoma in figure 510A, so you can see what that looks like. Now, squamous cell carcinoma arises from the keratinocytes that are above that basal layer, basically in the stratum spinosum layer. These guys, it's more unusual for them to become cancerous, so if they do, it's pretty aggressive, and so they can metastasize, meaning they can move throughout the body, go back to the dermis, get into the lymphatic system, the blood system, and move around the body, which is very dangerous. So if you don't remove this, there's a risk of it spreading. But anyways, that's called squamous cell carcinoma in figure B. Now, melanoma is the riskiest of all of these. It's highly metastatic, Melanoma is cancer of the melanocytes. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but melanocytes are not supposed to divide. Once you have your melanocytes, they shouldn't reproduce. They shouldn't be undergoing mitosis. You have your melanocytes, they stay in that stratum basal, and they produce melanin for your lifetime. They shouldn't just be dividing and replacing themselves. So if they do start to undergo mitosis and divide, that's extremely dangerous, and they're highly metastatic, so they can, again, move through the body and set up cancers in other part of the body. But you can see the melanoma over on page, or figure C. I don't know if you guys have heard of the ABCD rule, but this is, if you see something funny on your skin, you do the ABCD rule. A is, what's the symmetry? If this little dot or spot you see on your skin is asymmetrical, that's a warning sign. That could be dangerous. Border irregularity. So is it confined and does it look like it's outlined, or does it look like it's moving out of those outlined areas? That's a warning sign. Color, is it a different color? Has this color changed recently? Is it getting darker? That's a warning sign. And then diameter, they say the diameter should be about the size of a pencil eraser, and if it starts to grow, obviously that's a warning sign. So that's the ABCD rule. Anyways, pretty interesting for skin cancers there. All right, now let's go to burns. There's kind of a scary picture on page 166, figure 511 and 512. But a burn, the definition of a burn is tissue damage resulting from something. Heat, electricity, chemicals, a number of things can cause burns. But burns are divided into first degree, second degree, third degree burns. And you can see these in figure 512. Excuse me. But the definition of a first degree burn is damage of the tissues only in the epidermis. So a first degree burn, you would look red. So you would damage some of those cells in the epidermis. The dermal layer blood vessels would dilate just because of the heat, and so you'd look red. But that's it. So just like a regular sunburn without any blisters, that would be a first degree burn. A second degree burn is when you actually damage the epidermis and the upper region of the dermis, so the upper part of the dermis. So epidermis, the upper part of the dermis. And in that case, you would turn red, but then you could get blisters, whether blood blisters or just fluid-filled blisters. Third degree burn damages all the way, the epidermis, all the way down the dermis to the subcutaneous layer. Can even get to the muscles. So third degree burn is the entire thickness of the skin, basically down to the muscle. And you can see that one all the way down there. So burns are very serious. One of the main things, first thing, if you were to get a severe burn, is you could lose a lot of fluid. So that's one of the first things. If you have severe burns, you could lose a lot of fluid because you've lost some of that skin. Second would be risk of infection, because that's basically our number one protection is our skin. So you lose that, infection could set in really fast. But if you're ever curious on how they give the percentages, like, oh, they were burned over 30% of their body or something like that, it shows the percentages in figure 511 and how they actually do those percentages for the body. So good. So I believe that's everything for this chapter. Like I said, if you guys have any questions, write them down. You can email them to me or ask me before class on Tuesday. All right. Hope this video works. See you October 3rd.